The summer had begun. My family and I arrived on the coast of California. This house, old but still cozy, stood on the sand as if it had been placed there long before the roads appeared. My parents chose this spot to spend the entire summer far from the city, away from the usual routine. Their enthusiasm was contagious, but to me, it all felt exhausting. Long trips, new places, unfamiliar faces. We finally parked and I stepped onto the hot sand. The car was still steaming from the long drive, but I took a deep breath of salty sea air. In that moment, for the first time in a long while, I felt light. But just as that feeling arrived, it was replaced by a strange unease. Unclear, intangible, but persistent, it crept into my mind, leaving a trace of anxiety behind. "Go check out the beach while we unload," my mom suggested. I nodded and made my way toward the water. The waves rolled slowly toward the shore, washing away my footprints in the sand. It seemed like this moment should have been perfect, but something kept me from relaxing. I couldn't understand what it was. The wind splashed cool water on my face, and at that moment, I felt a touch on my shoulder. Turning abruptly, I saw Trevor, my stepbrother. His face was strangely tense, his gaze distant. "What are we doing here?" His voice was quiet, but there was something unsettling in it. Unexpectedly, I felt a chill inside. "What do you mean?" "We're on vacation," I replied, trying to smile, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his question had a much deeper meaning than it seemed. Trevor didn't respond, just nodded, but his expression remained unchanged. Ever since he had joined our family a few years ago, there had always been something undefined between us, but I tried not to dwell on it. Yet now, looking into his eyes, I realized that feeling was coming back. Trevor stood next to me, silent and withdrawn, as if something was holding him back from normal conversation. His eyes were still gazing off into the distance, beyond the horizon, as if he were searching for answers to questions he didn't want to ask. Usually, he was calm and somewhat detached, but today it seemed different. There was a strange, unexplainable tension in his behavior. I tried not to dwell on it. We had always been polite to each other, but there was no closeness. Still, our family had long accepted that Trevor wasn't the most open person. He was just one of us, but never completely. "You're acting strange," I remarked, hoping to break the tension somehow. "Strange?" He smirked, but there was something bitter in that smirk. "Maybe. It's just—" He paused for a moment before continuing. "I just have a weird feeling about this place." "A feeling?" I asked, now more on edge. "It's hard to explain." He suddenly turned toward me, and in his eyes I saw something troubled, something I hadn't seen before. "It's like everything around here isn't quite real. Like something's off." In that moment, I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. I tried to laugh, but the sound came out strained and unconvincing. "It's just a new house. We'll get used to it," I said, sensing that my words felt far too light for everything I was feeling inside. "Maybe," he responded quietly, never taking his eyes off the horizon. "But still, be careful." His last comment made me freeze in place. I looked back at the sea, trying to find some explanation in the water and the waves, but there was nothing except the soft whisper of the surf. Inside me, the tension I couldn't explain kept growing. Trevor glanced at me one last time before turning away, walking slowly back toward the house. I stayed where I was, watching him go, and I knew this conversation wouldn't be forgotten easily. The unease I had felt before our encounter only intensified. We were in a new, old house by the sea, on vacation. But why did this place make me feel so unsettled? And why did Trevor's words seem to amplify that feeling even more? When we returned to the house, my parents were just finishing unloading the car. Dad, noticing us, raised his hand in a greeting gesture, but his face looked concerned. Mom stood nearby, nervously adjusting her hat, engaged in a conversation with a man I didn't immediately recognize. It was the owner of the house, hunched over with a tired expression. "Is something wrong?" I asked, approaching. Mom turned to me with that forced smile she always wore when things weren't going according to plan. Turns out 2 of the bedrooms aren't ready, she said, trying to keep her voice light. We'll have to make do for a bit. What do you mean, not ready? Trevor asked, his expression turning serious. Renovations, the owner said, looking at us from under his thick eyebrows. They didn't finish in time, but in a couple of days, everything will be fine. And where are we going to sleep? I could feel the tension rising again. Your father and I will take one of the finished rooms, Mom said, looking at me with that same artificial smile. And you and Trevor will have to share another room for now. It's just for a couple of days. I froze. Share a room with Trevor? The awkwardness from our earlier conversation on the beach still lingered, and the thought of being in the same room together made it worse. But I tried not to show my discomfort. Well, I finally said, forcing a smile. Just a couple of days. We'll manage. Trevor nodded without saying a word, but his expression said more than enough. He was clearly not happy with the situation. We entered the house. Our room was small, with 2 narrow beds separated by a small table. Sunlight streamed through the old curtains, casting a soft but unsettling glow over the room. Cozy, Trevor muttered, walking over to the window and peering outside. I couldn't tell if he was being sarcastic or trying to find something to calm himself. I dropped my things on the bed and sat down. A heavy silence hung in the air, just as awkward as our lack of conversation. Each of us tried to occupy ourselves to avoid speaking. I picked up my phone and began scrolling through the newsfeed, but my mind kept drifting back to what had happened on the beach and his words. Be careful. My fingers trembled involuntarily, and I tried to focus on the screen, but it was useless. Deep inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was bound to happen. The night in the small room was as uncomfortable as the silent hours leading up to bedtime. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the monotonous whisper of the waves outside. Usually, that sound calmed me, but now it felt unsettling, as if it was murmuring something just beyond the edge of hearing. Trevor's words kept replaying in my mind. Be careful. But careful of what? Trevor sat on his bed, arms crossed, as if trying to physically contain some inner unease. I turned onto my side, attempting to focus on my book, but the words blurred together, and my thoughts kept drifting back to our conversation on the beach. Can't you relax? Trevor suddenly said, his eyes still fixed on the window, his voice breaking the silence. I lifted my gaze from the book and looked at him, trying to keep my voice calm. It's just an unfamiliar place, I replied, and the room situation doesn't exactly help. Trevor turned abruptly away from the window and faced me, his expression serious, almost frightening. It's not just the place, he said quietly, tension lacing his voice. Don't you feel it? There's something off here, not with the house, but with us, with what's happening. I felt a tight knot form inside me. Yes, that sense of unease hadn't left me since we arrived. But I couldn't explain it. The words stuck in my throat until I gathered the courage to speak. What do you mean? I asked, trying to keep my anxiety hidden, but my voice betrayed a tremor. He sighed and looked away. It's hard to explain, he replied, rubbing his temples wearily. It's like we're not supposed to be here. Like something about this place is making us lose ourselves. Can't you feel it? I didn't know what to say. The strange atmosphere in the house, the tension between us, the awkward glances and conversations, they had all been weighing on me. And maybe that's what was pressing on both Trevor and me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. I feel it too, I finally admitted. And in that moment, I felt a strange relief, as if a burden had been lifted from my shoulders. But I don't understand what it is. Trevor nodded, as if hearing exactly what he had expected. Maybe it's just nerves, I added, trying to lighten the tension. A new house, unfamiliar surroundings. Maybe, he said, but there was doubt in his voice. Then he fell silent for a long pause before asking the question that had been hanging in the air. Are you sure it's just nerves? I didn't know how to answer. In that moment, we both realized that this conversation had gone beyond merely sharing our worries. What did you mean on the beach? I asked, finally voicing the question I had been avoiding. When you said something wasn't right? He didn't respond immediately, as if carefully weighing his words. Recently, I've been feeling like everything around me isn't real, like the world has become fragile. And the further we go, the stronger that feeling gets. We looked at each other in silence, and before I fully realized what I was doing, I leaned toward him, and our lips met. It was brief, nervous, like a spark. But it happened. We pulled back, breathless, understanding that everything had changed in that moment. I sat at the edge of the bed, unable to process what had just happened. How could it have happened? The awkwardness hung in the air like a thick fog, and I had no idea what to do next. Trevor was the first to break the silence. He sat with his head bowed, avoiding my gaze. It was a mistake, he said hoarsely, as if forcing the words out. I felt my heart clench in my chest. Yes, I murmured, trying to stay calm, but inside I felt like I was being torn apart. You're right. But the moment still lingered between us. We could pretend that nothing had happened, but neither of us could forget the kiss. That night, I couldn't sleep. I could hear Trevor shifting restlessly on his bed. It seemed like every sound, every shadow in the room only amplified the strange unease that we both felt. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. Trevor? I called softly, not sure if he even wanted to talk to me after what had happened. He turned to me slowly, his eyes filled with exhaustion and something else. Something I couldn't quite recognize. What did you mean? I asked. Back on the beach, you said you felt like everything wasn't real. What did that mean? He was silent for a moment, staring thoughtfully into the darkness outside the window, and I thought he wasn't going to answer. I don't know, he finally said, his voice slow and quiet, as if he were piecing his thoughts together. But lately, I just feel like everything around me is losing its meaning. Like we're living in some kind of illusion, as if none of this belongs to us. And I can't explain it. But this is real, I said, trying to reclaim some sense of certainty. All of this is real. Trevor shook his head, his voice dropping even lower, almost a whisper. Then why can't I feel like I'm part of it? It's as if something is keeping me at a distance, like something's holding me back from being fully here. And I can't shake that feeling. Trevor, I began, not knowing how to continue. You're not alone. I feel like something's wrong too, but we can fix this. He didn't respond. We sat there in silence, and despite his dark words, a strange feeling of understanding passed between us. It was more than just the kiss or the tension. It was something deeper, something we couldn't control. It was a mistake, he repeated, but his voice was softer now, as if he didn't fully believe it himself. I shouldn't have. It's not just your mistake, I interrupted him, feeling my heart begin to race again. We both did this, and neither of us knows what to do about it now. Trevor fell silent once more, his eyes reflecting the weight of what we both knew but couldn't articulate. The kiss had changed something, but the strange atmosphere, the unspoken feelings, and the unsettling sensation that had gripped us since we arrived seemed to hint that there was something bigger at play, something beyond either of us. The morning didn't begin the way I had expected. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the curtains, filling the room with a soft glow, but the atmosphere was far from peaceful. I lay in bed, watching the dust dance in the beams of light, but the thought of the previous night lingered heavily in my mind. Trevor and I remained silent, each lost in our own thoughts. I felt strange, awkward, anxious, as if the world around us had shifted overnight. I got up, avoiding looking in his direction, and headed to the bathroom. The cold water stung my face, but it didn't help calm the turmoil raging inside me. I tried to organize my thoughts, but everything led back to the kiss, to the words we hadn't said to each other. When I came out, Trevor was already dressed, preparing to head downstairs for breakfast. He stood by the window, seemingly absorbed in his own thoughts. There was something heavy in his expression, as if he was trying to make sense of what we had done. I could feel that the unspoken conversation still hung between us, and the uncertainty made me uneasy. "Shall we go?" His voice was cold, but not distant. He didn't look at me, but I noticed his fingers tapping nervously on the windowsill. "Yeah," I replied briefly, and we left the room. Downstairs, our parents were already at the kitchen table, cheerfully discussing the plans for the day. Mom was telling Dad about the local aquarium, while he, as usual, nodded approvingly, more focused on his next cup of coffee. "How did you sleep?" Mom asked brightly, turning to me. Her eyes were filled with their usual warmth and care, but I couldn't force even the faintest smile. "Fine," I answered, trying to avoid looking at Trevor, who had seated himself across from me. "We were thinking of going to the aquarium today, and maybe stopping by the market afterward. The locals say it's full of interesting things," Mom continued, oblivious to the tension between Trevor and me. "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea," I said, nodding uncertainly, eager to steer the conversation into safer territory. Trevor sat silently, staring down at his breakfast. I could tell he was struggling to keep up with the conversation with our parents, responding in short phrases, trying to avoid any deeper engagement. Between us, the invisible tension grew stronger, though it seemed no one but us could feel it. "You and Trevor could explore the town while we're at the aquarium," Dad suggested, noticing our silence. "There's probably something fun to see, especially along the waterfront." The thought of spending the day alone with Trevor, after everything that had happened last night, made my stomach knot. But I knew refusing would raise questions, and that was the last thing I wanted. "Sure," I agreed, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Trevor merely nodded, still avoiding eye contact, and at that moment, I realized that today would be a test for both of us. We could pretend everything was fine, we could try to forget, but the underlying tension between us only seemed to intensify. As we finished breakfast, Mom cheerfully announced, "All right, time to get moving. We've got a busy day ahead. Get ready and we'll head out in half an hour." I felt as though the world around me was spinning faster and faster, but I couldn't seem to find a steady place to stand. The weight of what had happened between us the night before hung over everything, and I wasn't sure how we were supposed to make it through the day without confronting it. The day was sunny and quiet. Trevor and I walked slowly along the boardwalk, trying to find something to distract us from the tension hanging between us. We walked in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, and although life bustled around us, tourists snapping photos by the sea, children running on the beach, vendors loudly calling to passers-by, for us, the world seemed to slow down. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" Trevor finally broke the silence, but his voice was subdued, as if he said it only to fill the quiet in his own mind. "Yeah," I replied without turning to him. "It is." But the beauty of this place felt distant, unreal. We wandered through the marketplace, past stalls filled with trinkets, the smell of food, the laughter and music surrounding us. But none of it could dispel the awkwardness that lingered between us. We came to a small cafe by the water and, without a word, sat down at a table. The wind played with my hair, but the cool breeze brought no relief. The waitress took our order, 2 cups of coffee, and left us alone with our thoughts. Finally, Trevor sighed heavily and looked at me. His eyes were filled with exhaustion, mixed with the same sense of guilt I had been carrying since the morning. "Listen," he began. "We need to talk about what happened." I nodded, knowing we couldn't avoid it any longer. "You were right," I started quietly. "It was a mistake." Trevor gave a small, bitter smile, but there was no joy in it. "Yeah," he agreed, "but somehow I feel like just admitting that doesn't change anything. We can't just ignore what happened." "I know," I said, "and I can't stop thinking about it. How do I put it? I feel like something is happening that's beyond us, like we've lost our way. This place, this house, they're affecting us. I feel it too, he said softly. We shouldn't be in this situation, but it's like something is pushing us down this path, even when we know it's wrong. Trevor suddenly leaned in across the table, his voice dropping to a near whisper. That kiss. He hesitated, searching for the right words. It was a mistake, yes. But it wasn't just because we're tired or because the atmosphere is weird. We both know that there's something between us, something we both feel. His words hit me like a bolt of lightning. I had feared this acknowledgement, because I couldn't deny that he was right. What had happened wasn't just a mistake or a fleeting moment of weakness. It was something more. We both understood that, but neither of us knew what to do about it. And what now? I finally asked, my voice trembling. Trevor lowered his gaze and then looked out to the sea as if the answer might lie somewhere beyond the horizon. Now, we need to forget about it, he said at last, turning to face me again. It was an impulse, a mistake we can't repeat. I nodded, though every part of me protested against that decision. We were making the right choice, but it brought no sense of relief. Trevor took a sip of his coffee, his expression returning to its familiar coldness and restraint. I agree, he said quietly. We'll go back home and pretend this never happened. And with that, a heavy finality settled over us, like a door closing on something that had already begun to feel inevitable. As evening fell, my parents decided to set up a small bonfire on the beach. They were in great spirits, gathering firewood and laughing about some shared memories. Trevor and I sat near the fire, but it felt as if we were two strangers, separated by an invisible wall. The weight of our recent decision, to forget, hung between us like an oppressive burden neither of us could shake off. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the darkening sky, and the waves relentlessly crashed against the shore, like a ticking clock counting down to something inevitable. My parents sat off to the side, absorbed in their conversation, while silence stretched between me and Trevor. We didn't look at each other. Each of us focused on the fire, the distant horizon, anything to avoid acknowledging the tension between us. At one point, I decided it was time to leave. I couldn't bear the silence any longer, this oppressive quiet that spoke more than words ever could. I was about to stand when I suddenly felt Trevor's hand gently, almost imperceptibly, brush against mine. The world froze. I didn't dare look at him, but I could feel his presence closer than ever, the tension between us growing again. That brief contact was like a fleeting gust of wind, but it made something inside me tighten. The sense that we were on the edge of something inevitable became even stronger. We need to talk, he whispered, so softly that our parents couldn't hear. My heart raced. I knew what was coming, but part of me still fought against it. We've already talked, I replied, trying to keep my tone steady, though inside a storm was raging. We agreed to forget. But I can't, he said, his voice quiet but insistent. I can't forget. I slowly turned to face him. His face was illuminated by the fire, shadows playing across his sharp features, making him look almost unfamiliar. In that moment, he looked different than usual. His eyes locked with mine, and in them I saw what I had been trying to hide all day. Desire. The same feeling we had both been struggling to suppress. Trevor? I whispered, feeling everything inside me crumbling. He didn't let me finish. In one swift motion, he leaned in and our lips met once more. This kiss was longer, more certain, yet still filled with the same anxious tension as the first. The fire continued to crackle, and our parents sat just a few feet away, laughing and chatting, unaware of what was happening. But between us, the feelings we had been so desperately trying to suppress flared up again. Trevor looked at me, and in his eyes there was no regret, only confusion and something else I couldn't quite name. I don't know what's happening to us, he said softly, but I can't just let it go. His words echoed what I had been feeling deep down but had been too afraid to admit. There was no denying it anymore. Something had changed between us, and no matter how hard we tried to resist it, it wasn't going away. The morning felt even more unbearable. I got up quietly, dressed, and left the room, trying not to wake him. Almost as soon as I stepped outside, I heard footsteps behind me. Trevor had followed, sitting down next to me, his face tired, as if he hadn't slept all night either. "You're avoiding me," he said, looking out toward the sea. "We need to talk," I began, unable to meet his gaze. "What's happening between us has to end." Trevor didn't say anything. I knew he understood that I was right, but that didn't make it any easier. My heart raced, and I could still feel the taste of those kisses lingering on my lips, the ones we'd shared over the past 2 days. "We're family, Trevor," I continued, my voice trembling. "Even if we're not related by blood, it doesn't change anything. We shouldn't keep going. It's wrong." "I know," he said quietly. "But why doesn't it feel wrong when we're together? Why doesn't it seem like a mistake?" "Because it is wrong," I said, finally meeting his eyes. "We're confused. This house, these emotions. We've let ourselves get swept up in something that shouldn't exist." Trevor fell silent, staring down at the sand beneath his feet. "You're right," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's wrong, but that doesn't make it any easier." "We need to stop before things get even worse," I whispered. "Or we'll destroy not only ourselves, but everything around us." Trevor nodded, and I felt the tension that had been unbearable for the last few days begin to slowly ease between us. It was a painful decision, the hardest one we'd made, but it was the only right one. We agreed to forget. Agreed not to talk about it anymore. Yet, despite that, an emptiness settled in my heart. We'd made the right choice, but the feeling that something precious had been lost wouldn't leave me. When we returned to the house, Trevor said just one thing. "I'll keep my distance. It's the right thing to do, but just know, this isn't the end." I didn't respond. There was a strange certainty in his voice that left me uneasy. The drive home was strangely quiet. We traveled along familiar roads, and a tense silence hung in the car, unbroken even by my parents' usual conversations. They talked about plans for the fall, work, how refreshing the trip had been, but their voices felt like background noise, distant and disconnected from me. I sat in the back seat, staring out the window, watching the trees and houses blur past. But inside, I felt empty. Everything that had happened at that house by the sea seemed far away, almost unreal, as if it had happened to someone else. But every time I thought of Trevor, that emptiness was filled with pain. He sat beside me, his eyes fixed on his phone. But we both knew neither of us was truly focused on what was happening around us. We exchanged the occasional neutral comment, as if everything had already been said, and we both understood that returning home wouldn't change anything. We had made a decision and tried to stick to it. But every time our eyes met by accident, I could feel that something between us was still unresolved. When we finally reached home, for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of relief. The house felt safe, familiar, as if it could shield me from the chaos in my mind. I unloaded my things and headed straight to my room, not wanting to see Trevor or discuss anything further. I needed time to process everything that had happened and try to deal with it on my own. But as soon as I began unpacking, my phone buzzed with a new message. I picked it up and saw Trevor's name on the screen. "It's not over." Those 4 words made my heart stop. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, unsure of how to respond. Inside, conflicting emotions raged. I wanted to believe that we could put it all behind us, but something deep down told me Trevor was right. This wasn't over. Now that we were back to normal life, nothing felt simple anymore. We had both tried to make the right decision, but our feelings proved stronger. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing. Our relationship would never be the same. With the uneasy realization that the future was unpredictable and perhaps dangerous, I turned off my phone and lay down on the bed, trying to fall asleep. But peace wouldn't come. The events of that summer had left a mark on my heart, one I couldn't erase.